Karen dragged her son to my cabin's front door and declared, "This log house will be the birthday gift I want to give him." She pointed her finger straight at my face and said, "You should retreat peacefully if you don't want to be sued." I let out a cold laugh. Karen immediately called 911, crying and screaming. "An intruder is threatening me and my son." Before I could say anything, the police car had already arrived. The officer stepped out, his hand resting on his gun, his cold eyes staring directly at me. I stood still, not reacting. Then Her saw something on my chest, and instantly both his attitude and tone changed completely. "Yes, Major General. How can we assist you today, sir?" "Music, let me tell you where I'm watching from, and I'll start from the beginning. 6 months ago, I inherited this lakeside cabin from my grandfather, never imagining it would become the center of the most twisted conspiracy I'd ever. My name is Michael Harrison, and I'm a retired architect who spent 30 years serving in military intelligence. This cabin, nestled on the shores of Pine Lake, had been my sanctuary since childhood. Every summer, Grandpa would teach me to fish from the old wooden duck, always saying, "Mikey, remember, the biggest fish aren't the strongest stones, they're the most patient ones. They wait for exactly the right moment to bite." The confrontation that brought police to my door had been brewing for months. Orchestrated by Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of Pine Lake Community's Homeowners Association. Karen was a former corporate lawyer in her late 40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She had a way of making everything sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable, a skill she'd clearly perfected. During her legal career, her son, Brandon, a 23-year-old with an attitude problem and hands that had never seen real work, followed her around like a loyal puppy, ready to bark on command. That morning I was reviewing architectural blueprints on my deck when I heard car doors slamming. Karen emerged from her pristine white SUV, wearing a business suit that screamed, "I'm important." With Brandon trailing behind her, looking uncomfortable in clothes that were too tight, she marched up to my cabin with the confidence of someone who owned the place, which was ironic considering she'd been trying to force me out for months. "Mr. Harrison," she called out in her sickeningly sweet voice that dripped with false politeness, "I hope you've reconsidered our generous offer." I sat down my coffee and walked to the edge of the deck, looking down at her. "There was no offer, Karen. There were demands and threats, but no actual offer." Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator underneath before she composed herself again. "Well, that's unfortunate because Brandon here has his heart set on this place for his birthday. Don't you, sweetie?" Brandon nodded eagerly, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was clearly uncomfortable with whatever game his was playing, but too weak to stand up to her. Karen continued, "This cabin would make such a perfect retreat for a young man starting his life. So private, so isolated from prying neighbors. The soundproofing in that basement would be ideal for his music studio." The way she emphasized those words made my skin crawl, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. "The cabin isn't for sale, Karen, and it never will be," I replied firmly. "My grandfather built this place with his own hands, and it's staying in the family." Her eyes flashed with anger. Anish took a step closer to the deck. "Mr. Harrison, I've tried to be reasonable with you, but you're making this much harder than it needs to be. This community has standards, and frankly, your presence here disrupts the harmony we've worked so hard to create. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if you simply accepted the inevitable and moved somewhere more suitable for someone of your circumstances." That's when she made her fatal mistake. Karen pulled out her phone and dialed 911, turning on the waterworks like she was auditioning for an Oscar. "Please help us. There's a dangerous man at 47 Lakeshore Drive who's threatening me and my son. He's being very aggressive and won't let you leave." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here I was standing on my own deck holding a cup of coffee while she played the victim card from my front yard. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone trying to steal my property was calling me the criminal. Within minutes, I heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel as Officer Rodriguez's patrol car pulled into my driveway. I recognized him immediately, having seen him around town, but we'd never been formally introduced. He stepped out of his vehicle with the practiced caution of a seasoned cop, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon as he assessed the situation. His eyes were sharp and alert as they moved from Karen's tearful performance to my calm presence on the deck. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem here?" he asked Karen. Though his gaze never left me, Karen immediately launched into her rehearsed sober story, complete with dramatic gestures and crocodile tears. "Officer, this man has been harassing my family for months. He's threatened to hurt my son if we don't stop asking him to sell his property to us. Just now, when we came to make one final reasonable offer, he became violent and aggressive. I'm afraid for us. Brandon nodded along like a trained seal, though I could see he was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. Officer Rodriguez listened patiently, then turned his attention to me. Sir, I'm going to need you to step down from the deck slowly, and keep your hands visible. I complied without argument, understanding the position he was in. As I walked down the steps, my military bearing evident in my posture and movements, something caught Rodriguez's eye. He squinted at my chest, focusing on the small pin I wore on my jacket. It was a simple piece of military jewelry, nothing flashy or obvious, just a small insignia that most civilians would recognize. But Rodriguez wasn't most civilians, and I could see the exact moment recognition dawned in hindsight. His entire demeanor shifted from suspicious authority figure to respectful subordinate in the span of a heartbeat. Major General Harrison, he asked, his voice filled with disbelief and recognition. Sir, I served under your command in the 82nd Airborne Division. Sergeant Rodriguez, 3rd Battalion. He straightened to attention, his hand moving away from his weapon to offer a crisp salute. Yes, Major General. How can we assist you today, sir? The transformation was complete, and I could see Karen's confident expression crumbling as she realized her carefully orchestrated plan had just hit an unexpected snag. Karen's face went through a series of interesting color changes, from smug satisfaction to confusion to something approaching panic. She stared at me as if seeing a ghost, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I checked your records thoroughly. I ran background checks. There was no military information, no mention of any rank or service. How could you be a major general? I smiled coldly at her obvious distress, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. You think the records of a major general in military intelligence are easy to find? Karen, you really should have done your homework better. Now, to understand how we got to this point, I need to take you back 6 months to when everything began. I had just read from 30 years of military service, most of it spent in intelligence operations that I still can't discuss even today. The transition from major general to civilian life wasn't easy. And when my grandfather's lawyer called to inform me that I'd inherited the Pine Lake cabin, it felt like a sign from above. The old man had always promised the place would be mine someday, but I never expected it to become my lifeline to sanity. The cabin itself was a modest 2-bedroom log structure built in 1967, nothing fancy by modern standards, but solid Asa rock. What made it special wasn't the building, it was the location and the memories. Perched on 3 acres off from lakefront property, it offered complete privacy with a small beach and that weathered wooden dock where Grandpa had taught me patience through fishing. The basement was surprisingly spacious, originally designed as a workshop, but converted over the years into storage space. Most importantly to me, it was the one place on Earth where I could hear myself think after decades of military noise and chaos. Pine Lake community had grown up around the original lakefront cabins over the past 2 decades, transforming from a collection of weekend retreats into a year-round residential area, governed by an increasingly powerful homeowners association. When I first moved in, the neighbors were friendly enough, curious about the new guy, but respectful of privacy. That lasted exactly 2 weeks until Karen Mitchell introduced herself at my front door with a basket of muffins and a smile that set off every alarm bell my military training had installed in my brain. Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Harrison, she had said, her voice honey, but her eyes calculating as they swept over my property. I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. We're so excited to have new blood in the community. She handed me the muffins and immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about community standards, property values, and the importance of maintaining neighborhood harmony. What struck me as odd was how many questions asked about my personal life. Did I have family? Would anyone be visiting regularly? Was I planning to live here full-time or just weekends? You have such a lovely property. Kieran continued, craning her neck to pry around me into the cabin's interior. That basement must be quite spacious. These older cabins were built with such generous proportions. Very private, too. I imagine you could probably have all sorts of activities down there and no one would ever hear a thing. The way she said it made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to her being one of those overly interested neighbor types that every community seems to attract. I thanked her for the muffins and tried to politely end the conversation, but she lingered on my porch like she was waiting for an invitation to explore. Over the following weeks, Karen found excuse after excuse to visit. She brought me community newsletters, invited me to HOA meetings, and always managed to work the conversation around to my family situation, and whether Eva got lonely living by myself. It's such a shame to see a beautiful property like this sitting empty most of their time, she would say, gazing wistfully at my cabin. A place like this should be full of life, don't you think? Maybe a young family with children who could really appreciate what it has to offer. I began to suspect she was fishing for information about my intentions for the property, though I couldn't figure out her angle yet. The first warning sign came when I received an official letter from the Pine Lake HOA about potential violations of community standards. According to Karen's carefully worded document, my dock needed immediate repairs. My landscaping wasn't up to standards, and my mailbox didn't conform to approved designs. None of these issues had been mentioned during any of her friendly visits, and the penalties for non-compliance were surprisingly steep. When I called the HOA office to discuss the letter, Karen's secretary informed me that Mrs. Mitchell was very busy, but would be happy to schedule a meeting to discuss my compliance options. That meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon in home office, where she sat behind an oversized desk like a queen holding court. She had all my property documents spread out in front of her, along with what appeared to be detailed research about my background. Mr. Harrison, I hope you understand that these violations aren't personal, she began, though everything about her tone suggested otherwise. We simply have standards to maintain in Pine Lake. Property values depend on everyone doing their part. When I pointed out that my grandfather had never been cited for any violations in over 50 years, she smiled that cold smile again. Times change, and so do standards. Your grandfather was grandfathered in under old regulations that, frankly, weren't strict enough. As she talked, I noticed something interesting. Karen kept glancing at a file folder marked with my name, and every so often she would check her phone and frown. She seemed frustrated about something, as if she wasn't finding what she was looking for. During a pause in her lecture about community harmony, she leaned forward and asked, Mr. Harrison, I'm curious about your background. You seem like a man with interesting stories to tell. Military service perhaps? It's always nice to know more about our neighbors. The way she asked made it clear this wasn't casual curiosity. She was fishing for specific information. I keep my private life private, Karen, I replied, watching her expression carefully, but I'm happy to discuss any legitimate HOA concerns you might have. Her smile faltered slightly, and I could see the wheels turning behind those calculating eyes. She spent the rest of our meeting trying different approaches to get me to open up about my past, my finances, and my long-term plans for the cabin. Each question was wrapped in a burly concern, but the intent was obvious. She was building a file on me, though I still couldn't figure out why. That night, as I sat on my deck watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself thinking about Grandpa's fishing lessons. He'd always told me that patience was the key to landing the big ones, but he'd also taught me to recognize when something was taking the bait for the wrong reasons. Karen Mitchell was definitely fishing for something, and I had a feeling that whatever she was after had nothing to do with community standards or prototypes. The next morning, I discovered my mailbox had been tampered with, though nothing appeared to be missing. Later that day, I noticed someone had been walking around my property, leaving footprints in the soft earth near my basement windows. When I found a crumpled piece of paper stuck in my screen door, my blood ran cold. Written in shaky handwriting were just 3 letters. Help MEH. Someone was trying to reach me and they were terrified. The mysterious note changed everything. For me, that shaky handwriting haunted my thoughts as I tried to piece together what might have left it and what they needed help with. But before I could investigate further, Karen escalated her campaign against me with a vengeance that caught me off guard. The very next week, my mailbox was stuffed with official HOA violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, my grass was too tall by half an inch, my cabin's natural wood stain was inconsistent with community color standards, and my dock needed toe pressure washed to maintain acceptable appearance levels. What really got my attention was how specific and targeted these violations were. Every rule seemed custom-written to apply only to my property, and when I pulled out the HOA bylaws I'd received when I moved in, half of these regulations didn't exist. Karen had been busy holding emergency board meetings that I was conveniently never notified about, passing new rules designed specifically to make my life miserable. The penalties were substantial, too, starting at $500 per violation and escalating quickly 4 repeat offenses. She was trying to find me out of my own home. I decided it was time to fight back with some intelligence gathering of my own. Using skills I developed over 30 years in military intelligence, I set up a discrete recording system to monitor the common areas where HOA meetings were supposedly held. What I discovered was illuminating Karen was indeed holding secret meetings, but not with the full board as required by HOA regulations. Instead, she was meeting with just 2 other residents who seemed more interested in gossiping than governing, rubber stamping whatever she put in front of them without question. During one of these recorded sessions, I heard Karen say something that made my blood run cold. The Harrison situation needs to be resolved quickly. She told her cronies, I've got another project that requires his property, and I can't afford to wait much longer. If the fines didn't work, we'll have to get more creative. When one of the other board members asked what she meant by more creative, Karen's voice dropped to a whisper. Let's just say that Mr. Harrison might find his living situation becomes uncomfortable enough that he'll want to leave voluntarily. The harassment campaign began in earnest the following week. My HOA fees suddenly doubled, with Karen claiming I owed back assessments for special lakefront maintenance that had never been mentioned before. The community's landscaping crew began showing up at dawn outside my cabin, running leaf blowers and lawnmowers right outside my bedroom windows. When I complained, Corin's secretary informed me that the crew had every right to maintain community property, which apparently now included a 10ft strip along my property line that had never been community property before. Then came the utilities harassment. My electricity was cut off twice in 1 week for routine maintenance that somehow only affected my cabin. The water department received mysterious reports of possible contamination in my well, requiring expensive testing that came back clean both times. Karen was systematically trying to make my home unlivable, and she was doing it with a smile and official paperwork to back up every move. The psychological pressure was taking its toll, but I'd endured worse during my military career. What bothered me more was the mystery of that note. During my surveillance of the community, I'd started paying attention to patterns of behavior, and I noticed something odd about Karen's schedule. Every Tuesday and Friday, she would drive out of Pine Lake around 2 o'clock in the afternoon and return around 6 o'clock. Always looking slightly flustered and carrying a small black bag. She was visiting someone or something regularly, and whatever it was causing her stress. That's when Brandon made his first direct appearance in the harassment campaign. He showed up at my cabin one afternoon while I was replacing a dock board that had been damaged by the community's maintenance crew. Brandon had clearly been drinking, and he was more aggressive than I'd ever seen him. My mum's being way too nice to you, old man, he slurred, swaying slightly as he stood too close to where I was working. She keeps talking about doing this the legal way, but I think you need a more direct message about why you should leave. I stood up slowly, my full height and military bearing, making Brandon take an involuntary step backward. Son, I've been threatened by experts, and you're not even close to their league. I suggest you go home and sleep off whatever you've been. But Brandon was either too drunk or too stupid to recognize the warning in my voice. He pushed closer, trying to intimidate me with his younger age and larger frame. What he didn't realize was that I'd spent decades dealing with actual threats, and his amateur hour posturing was more amusing than frightening. You don't understand what you're messing with, Brandon continued, his voice getting louder and more slurred. My mum has connections who can't even imagine. She's got judges, lawyers, politicians, all kinds of people who owe her favors. If you don't get out of here voluntarily, she's going to make your life hell in ways you can't even dream of. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just making empty threats. Karen did seem to have an unusual amount of influence for a small community HOA president, and I was beginning to suspect there was more to her story than I'd initially realized. Just as Brandon was working himself up to what looked like it might become a physical confrontation, Karen's white SUV pulled into my driveway. She jumped out of the car looking panicked, clearly not expecting to find her son at my place. Brandon, what are you doing here? She called out, her voice sharp with worry. I told you to stay away from Mr. Harrison, but what really caught my attention was what she did next. She looked directly at me and said, I'm sorry about this. Brandon gets confused, Martins, especially when he's been drinking. He doesn't understand the delicate nature of certain situations. As she hustled Brandon toward her SUV, I heard her whisper urgently to him, Harry needs to be moved sooner than we planned. If you keep acting like this, you're going to ruin everything we've worked for. The name Harry meant nothing to me at the time, but the way she said it, like she was talking about a problem that needed to be solved, made me file it away for future investigation. As they drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just glimpsed something much darker than HOA harassment. Karen Mitchell was playing a game with stakes bigger than property disputes, and somehow that mysterious note was connected to whatever she was real. The name Harry that Karen had whispered to Brandon kept echoing in Midman. My military intelligence training had taught me that seemingly random information often formed patterns if Yauk knew how to look for them. So, I decided it was time to conduct a proper investigation using techniques I'd perfected over 3 decades of gathering intelligence. I began systematically researching Karen Mitchell's background, and what I found was far more disturbing than simple HOA power games. Karen's legal history was a fascinating study in manipulation and calculated cruelty. She'd been married 3 times before, and in each case, her wealthy husbands had died under circumstances that were tragic, but never quite suspicious enough to warrant serious investigation. Her first husband, a real estate developer, had suffered a fatal heart attack at age 52. The second, an insurance executive, had died in a single car accident on a rainy night. Both deaths had left Karen significantly wealthier, and both had occurred after she'd been married to them for exactly 2 years, just long enough to establish herself as the primary beneficiary, but not long enough to raise questions about timing. Following her pattern, I decided to track Karen's mysterious Tuesday and Friday trips, using my car's GPS and some discreet surveillance techniques. I discovered she was making regular visits to Mercy General Hospital, about 30 minutes from Pine Lake. This was interesting because Karen had never mentioned having any family members or friends in the hospital, and her trips were always scheduled at the same times, suggesting regular visiting hours rather than emergency visits. Something told me this wasn't a coincidental social call. On my 3rd surveillance mission, I decided to go inside the hospital and see what I could learn. Posing as a visitor looking for directions, I struck up a conversation with a volunteer at the information desk, an elderly woman who clearly enjoyed having someone to chat with. "Oh, you must mean Mrs. Mitchell," she said when I described Karen. She shared twice a week like clockwork to visit her husband Harry in room 314. Such a devoted wife. Though it's so sad to see what that poor man has been through. The doctors say his condition keeps getting worse despite all the treatments. My blood ran cold as the pieces started falling into place. Harry wasn't some abstract person Karen was worried about. He was her current husband, and he was in the hospital. Under mysterious circumstances, I managed to get a glimpse of him during visiting hours, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Harry Mitchell was a thin, frail man who looked to be in his late 60s, with graying hair and eyes that held a terrible awareness despite his obvious physical limitations. His left side appeared partially paralyzed, and when he tried to speak, only garbled sounds came out, though his eyes were alert and desperate. The most chilling part was watching Karen during her visit. She sat beside his bed with that same cold smile I'd seen so many times, holding a small cup of what appeared to be medication. "Here's your vitamin supplement, darling," she cooed in a voice that made my skin crawl. "The doctor says you need to take this twice a week to help with your recovery." Harry's eyes widened with what looked like terror, and he tried to turn his head away, but Karen gently but firmly held his chin and made him drink the entire contents of the cup. After she left, I managed to catch one of Harry's nurses in the hallway. "That's Mr. Mitchell," she explained sadly. "He came in about 8 months ago with what appeared to be a progressive neurological condition. The strangest thing is that his symptoms to worsen right after his wife's visits, but then stabilize until she comes back. The doctors are baffled, Bess. His test results show signs of chronic neurological toxicity, but they can't identify the source." She shook her head in frustration. "Mr. Mitchell tries to communicate something to us, but the damage to his speech centers makes it almost impossible to understand him." That evening I sat in my cabin trying to process what I discovered. The on the mysterious note suddenly made perfect sense. It matched the shaky, labored penmanship I'd seen Harry struggle with when he tried to write something for the nurse. He had been trying to reach out for help, probably during one of Karen's visits to my neighborhood when she was scoping out my property. The poor man was being systematically poisoned by his wife, and she needed my cabin for some reason connected to her murderous plan. The timeline was becoming clearer now. Karen had started showing interest in my cabin. Around the same time, Harry had been admitted to the hospital. Her questions about the basement soundproofing, the property's isolation, and whether I lived alone weren't random curiosity. They were reconnaissance for whatever she was planning to do with Harry next. The medical staff had mentioned that his condition seemed to be worsening, which meant Karen was probably accelerating her timeline for whatever final phase of her plan required my property. I spent the next several days documenting everything, wicked about Karen's hospital visits, her behavior patterns, and the connection between Harry's decline and her presence. Using a small digital recorder I'd hidden in the hospital's family lounge, I managed to capture part of a conversation between Karen and Brandon during one of their visits. "Mum, are you sure about this plan?" Brandon asked nervously. "What if someone figures out what we're doing to him?" Karen's response was chilling in its casual cruelty. "Nobody's going to figure anything out, sweetheart. Harry's just a sick old man whose condition is naturally, when the time comes to move him to more private care, everyone will understand that it's the compassionate thing to do." The phrase, "more private care," sent ice through my veins. Karen wasn't just poisoning Harry, she was preparing to move him somewhere isolated where she could finish the job without medical supervision. And based on her obsession with my cabin's basement and soundproofing, I was beginning to suspect that somewhere isolated was supposed to be my property. She had been planning to force me out, so she called my home as Harry's final prison, a place where his last days would be spent in agony while she waited for the poison to complete its work. As I sat on my deck that night, watching the moonlight dance on the lake surface, I heard a car pulling into my driveway. It was Karen alone this time, and she looked more desperate than I'd ever seen her. She got out of her car slowly, almost reluctantly, and walked toward my cabin with the demeanor of someone who was running out of options. When she knocked on my door, her usual confident mask was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Harrison, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There are some things about Harry that you need to understand, and some decisions that need to be made very quickly." Karen stood on my doorstep, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. But my military training had taught me never to trust an enemy's apparent weakness. "Come in," I said, gesturing toward my living room while keeping my distance. "But before you say anything, you should know that I've been doing some research of my own. I know about Harry, I know about your hospital visits, and I know about your previous husbands who had such unfortunate accidents." Her face went white as she realized the extent of what he'd discovered, but to her credit, she didn't try to deny it. "You don't understand the full situation, Mr. Harrison," she said, settling into my grandfather's old armchair with the practiced composure of someone who'd talked her way out of difficult situations before. "Harry isn't just my husband. He's worth $2.3 billion. Hammered his fortune in tech startups back in the 9 South. Sold his companies at exactly the right times. And when I married him 3 years ago, I thought I'd finally found the security I'd been seeking my entire life. But Harry turned out to be difficult, controlling, suspicious, always threatening to change his will if I didn't behave exactly as he wanted." As she talked, I watched her carefully, noting how she framed herself as the victim while casually admitting to a motive for murder that would have made her prosecutors salivate. "So, you decided to solve your marriage problems with poison," I said flatly. "How exactly does that work, Karen? What are you giving him during those touching bedside visits?" Her mask slipped completely, then revealing the cold-blooded killer underneath the concerned wife facade. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice taking on a chilling matter-of-fact tone. "Fine, I'll tell you. Because at this point you're either going to help me or you're going to become another problem. I need to solve." The plan she outlined was breathtakingly evil in its sophistication. Karen had begun poisoning Harry approximately 18 months into their marriage, using a combination of pharmaceuticals that she'd researched meticulously. "I started with small doses of Carrere derivative, heavily diluted," she explained as casually as if she were discussing a recipe. "Not enough to kill him quickly, just in order to gradually paralyze his motor functions. Then I added botulinum toxin injections to damage his vocal cords and speech centers. The beauty of it is that both substances leave the system relatively quickly, so by the time doctors run tests, they find traces that could be explained by legitimate medical treatments gone wrong." The diabolicalness of her method was that Harry remained mentally aware throughout his decline, trapped in a body that was slowly failing him while his ability to communicate his situation deteriorated. "He knows exactly what's happening to him," Karen continued with satisfaction. "He can see, he can think, he can understand everything around him, but he can't move properly and he can barely speak. The doctors think it's a rare neurological condition, and Harry can tell them otherwise because every time he tries to communicate, it comes out as incomprehensible mumbling." What made the situation even more horrifying was Karen's timeline. The original plan was to keep him in this state for about 2 years, long enough for his condition to seem like a natural progression of whatever mysterious illness the doctors thought he had. But recently, Harry's been getting more agitated, trying harder to communicate with the medical staff. I'm worried that eventually someone might start to understand what he's trying to say. So, I've decided to accelerate the schedule. That's where my cabin came into the picture, and hearing her explain it made my blood run cold. Harry needs to be moved to a more private care setting, Karen said, her eyes taking on that predatory gleam I'd seen before. Somewhere isolated, soundproof, where I can provide him with the specialized attention he requires during his final weeks. Your basement would be perfect, Mr. Harrison. It's far enough from other houses that no one would hear any disturbances, and the location would allow me to visit regularly without attracting attention from medical professionals who might ask uncomfortable questions. The scope of her planned cruelty was breathtaking. Karen intended to transform my cabin's basement into a private torture chamber, where Harry would spend his final days, completely isolated from any possibility of rescue or medical intervention. I would gradually increase the dosage of his medications until his body finally gives up, she explained. To the outside world, it would look like a devoted wife caring for her terminally ill husband in the comfort of a family friend's home. The death certificate would list natural causes related to his progressive neurological condition, and I'd inherit everything as his legal widow and But Karen's confession revealed even more disturbing truths about her past. My previous husbands weren't accidents either, she admitted with chilling pride. Richard, my first husband, actually did have a weak heart. I just helped it along with some creative pharmaceutical assistance. David, my second husband, was already taking medication for depression. So, when his car went off that cliff, everyone assumed he'd committed suicide. The insurance companies paid out without question, and I moved on to find my next opportunity. The revelation about Brandon was perhaps the most shocking of all. Brandon isn't actually my son, Karen said, noting my surprised expressions. He's my nephew, my sister's boy, but she died when he was 12, and I took him in. I've been grooming him 4 years to be my partner in these ventures. He's not the brightest bulb in the box, but he's loyal, and he follows instructions well. Plus, having a son gives me credibility as a grieving widow who's just trying to take care of her family. As Karen laid out the full extent of her murderous enterprise, I realized I was dealing with a serial killer who had perfected her methods over decades. She wasn't just planning to kill Harry, she was planning to continue this pattern indefinitely, finding wealthy men, marrying them, and slowly murdering them for their money while maintaining the facade of a devoted wife dealing with tragic circumstances. The beauty of the system, she concluded, is that it's completely sustainable. There's always another lonely rich man looking for companionship, and medical professionals are trained to trust grieving spouses. As long as I'm patient and careful, I can repeat this process every few years for the rest of my life. Harry's $2.30 billion will set me up nicely, but there's no reason to stop there. The casual way she discussed mass murder made my skin crawl, but it also clarified my situation completely. Karen wasn't just asking for my help, she was informing me that I was now part of her operation, whether I wanted to be or not. You see, Mr. Harrison, you know too much now to simply walk away. I need your cabin for Harry's final care. And you need to disappear quietly so that there are no witnesses to what happens next. I'm hoping we can arrange this in a way that benefits everyone. But if not, she'll let the threat hang in the air. Poison gas. As she prepared to leave, Karen turned back to me with that cold smile that had haunted me. I'll give you 24 hours to consider your options. Mr. Harrison, you can either help me complete Harry's care plan and receive generous compensation for your cooperation, or you can become another tragic example of what happens to people who interfere with things they don't understand. The choice is entirely yours. But either way, Harry will be moved to your basement by the end of the week. After Karen left, I knew I had less than 24 hours before she would put her plan into motion. But what she didn't realize was that her confession had given me everything I needed to destroy her completely. I'd spent 30 years in military intelligence, and the first rule of gathering information is to always be prepared to use it. While Karen had been talking, I'd been recording every word through the discreet digital recorder I kept running in my living room, a habit left over from my days handling classified. Her entire confession, including the details about poisoning Harry and murdering her previous bands, was now preserved in crystal clear audio. But I knew that having evidence and being able to use it effectively were two different things. Karen had demonstrated that she had connections throughout the community, and her influence extended far beyond the HOA. If I simply turned over the recording to local authorities, there was a real possibility that it would disappear or be dismissed as fabricated. I needed a plan that would expose her publicly in front of witnesses while simultaneously ensuring Harry's safety and my own survival. That's when I decided to give Karen exactly what she thought she wanted, but with a twist never see coming. I called her the next morning and agreed to her terms. "You win, Karen," I said, injecting defeat into my voice. "I'll cooperate with your plan, but I want compensation. And I want guarantees that this ends with Harry. No more threats, no more harassment, just a clean business transaction." She was practically purring with satisfaction as she accepted my surrender, telling me that Harry would be transferred to my cabin's basement the following evening, and that I should prepare to make myself scarce for a few weeks while she completed his care. What Karen didn't know was that I'd already contacted Officer Rodriguez and briefed him on the situation. At first, he was skeptical, understandably questioning whether a respected community leader like Karen could really be a serial killer, but when I played him portions of the recording, his attitude changed completely. "Major General, this is Waybay and local jurisdiction," he told me. "If what you're saying is true, we need federal involvement. The FBI has a task force that handles exactly this kind of case." Within hours, I was sitting across from Special Agent Sarah Collins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in cases involving medical murder and financial fraud. Agent Collins listened to the entire recording with the focused attention of a professional who'd heard similar stories before. "Mr. Harrison, what you've uncovered appears to be a sophisticated operation that's probably been going on for years. Based on the financial scope and the interstate nature of the crimes, we can definitely take jurisdiction, but need to catch her in the act to make sure the charges stick. Are you willing to help us set up a controlled operation?" I didn't hesitate. After 30 years of military service, the idea of letting a serial killer continue operating was unthinkable. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would appear to cooperate with Karen's demands while FBI agents positioned around my property to document everything. Harry would indeed be brought to my cabin, but instead off-bung imprisoned in my basement. He'd be immediately taken into protective custody and rushed to a hospital equipped to treat his poisoning. Meanwhile, Karen would be arrested the moment she committed any overt act that demonstrated her criminal intent. The next evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. Karen arrived at my cabin driving a white medical van with Brandon following in her SUV. She was dressed in scrubs and carried a medical bag, clearly planning to maintain the facade of providing legitimate nursing care, even during Harry's final imprisonment. What she didn't notice were the FBI surveillance vehicles positioned throughout my neighborhood, their occupants recording everything through HEPO-had cameras and directional microphones. Harry looked even worse than he had in the hospital. He was strapped to a gurney, his eyes wide with terror as he recognized my cabin from Karen's previous visits. When he saw me, those desperate eyes seemed to plead for understanding, and I gave him a subtle nod that I hoped conveyed that help was coming. Karen was all business as she directed Brandon to help transfer Harito in my basement, chattering cheerfully about how Uncle Harry would be much more comfortable in his new surroundings. "This is perfect, Mr. Harrison," she said as we descended into the basement. "The acoustics down here are excellent for privacy, and the temperature is ideal for Harry's condition. He'll be very comfortable during his final days." As she spoke, she was already preparing a syringe from her medical bag, filling it with what I now knew was a lethal cocktail designed to accelerate Harry's death. "This is a special medication that will help ease his transition," she explained to Brandon, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. But that's when everything went wrong with Karen's plan, and exactly right with mine. Instead of the isolated basement prison she'd expected, Karen found herself surrounded by FBI agents who'd been waiting in concealment. "Karen Mitchell, you earned our arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of fraud," Agent Collins announced as she stepped out from behind the basement support pillars. Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation from confident controlled Toshik to rage in a matter of seconds. But even as the handcuffs were going on, Karen wasn't finished fighting. "This instrument," she screamed. "Mr. Harrison, set me up. I was just trying to provide medical care for my sick husband." Her performance might have been convincing, if not for the syringe full of poison in her hand and the recording device that Agent Collins was already playing back. Karen's own voice filled the basement, clearly stating her intention to murder Harry and describing in detail how she'd killed her previous husbands. Brandon collapsed completely when he realized the scope of what they'd been involved in. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he sobbed as federal agents led him away in handcuffs. "She told me we were just helping Uncle Harry with his medical care. She said the doctors didn't understand his condition and that we were the only ones who could help him. His genuine distress was obvious, and I suspected he'd been as much a victim of Karen's manipulation as he was a willing accomplice. The real drama came when Thea tried to arrest Karen herself. Even faced with overwhelming evidence and federal agents, she maintained her facade of injured innocence. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she told Agent Collins. "Harry is a very sick man who requires specialized care that ordinary doctors can't provide. Everything I've done has been to help him, and now you're going to let him suffer because you've been deceived by a bitter old man who wanted revenge against our family." But her performance fell apart completely when Harry himself provided the final evidence against her. As the EMTs were preparing to transport him to the hospital, he managed to grab Agent Collins's hand with his partially functional right hand. Using every ounce of strength he could muster, he traced letters on her palm, KARENPOIS on HELP. It was weak and shaky, but clear enough for everyone present to understand. The look of absolute fury on Karen's face when she realized Harry had managed to communicate the truth was their most genuine emotion I'd seen from her since this whole nightmare began. As they loaded Karen into the federal transport vehicle, she looked directly at me with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've cost me," Harrison hissed. "Harry was going to set me up for life, and now you've ruined everything. Proud of yourself for protecting a man who would have been dead in a few weeks anyway." Her complete lack of remorse, even in the face of Ferrist, was chilling proof of how thoroughly evil she really was. Agent Collins stayed behind to brief me on what would happen next. "Mr. Harrison, you've helped us break up what appears to be a sophisticated serial killing. Based on the evidence we've gathered in Harry's testimony, we believe Karen may be responsible for as many as 5 deaths over the past 15 years. This case is going to make headlines, and you're going to be a witness in what's probably going to be one of the biggest murder trials this state has seen in decades." The trial of Karen Mitchell became the media sensation that Agent Collins had predicted, drawing national attention to a quiet Pine Lake community. For 3 months, reporters camped outside the courthouse as prosecutors laid out the full scope of Karen's murderous enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. The recorded confession, the poison found in her possession, Harry's testimony delivered through a specially designed communication device, and forensic evidence linking her to the deaths of her previous husbands. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. Karen received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, while Brandon was sentenced to 8 years. After cooperating fully with prosecutors and demonstrating genuine remorse for his role in the conspiracy, during his testimony, it became clear that Karen had been grooming him since childhood, gradually introducing him to her criminal activities while convincing him they were helping her husbands rather than harming them. The judge noted Brandon's genuine horror when he finally understood what he'd been for, recommending that he received counseling and support during his incarceration. Harry's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, though it required months of intensive medical treatment to counteract the effects of Karen's systematic poisoning. The toxicology team at Johns Hopkins worked around the clock to develop a triad that gradually restored function to his paralyzed muscles and vocal cords. By the time of Karen's sentencing, Harry had recovered approximately 80% of his motor functions and could speak clearly again, though his voice remained somewhat from the damage to his vocal cords. The first time Harry visited my cabin after we sat together on the dock where my grandfather had taught me patience through fishing. Michael Hesed, his voice still bearing traces of the ordeal he'd endured. "I never thought I'd see another sunset over this lake. There were nights in that hospital when Karen would leave after giving me those injections, and I'd lie there knowing I was dying by degrees, unable to tell anyone what was happening to me." He paused, watching the golden light dance across the water. "You gave me back my life, and I can never repay that debt." The Pine Lake community underwent its sound process of healing and redemption when the full scope of Karen's crimes became public knowledge. The residents who had shunned me during her harassment campaign were deeply ashamed of how easily they'd been manipulated. The Ho held an emergency meeting where they unanimously voted to make me an honorary lifetime member and offered to repair all the damage that had been done to my property during Karen's campaign against me. I declined the honorary position, but accepted their help with repairs, recognizing that the community needed to take positive action to process their collective guilt. Harry's response to his ordeal was characteristically generous and forward-thinking. Using a portion of his recovered fortune, He established the Harrison Mitchell Foundation for Domestic Violence Prevention, named in honor of both our family's experience with Karen's manipulation and abuse. The foundation focuses specifically on identifying and supporting victims of financial and medical abuse, particularly elderly individuals who may be targeted by predators seeking their wealth. Within its first year, the foundation helped 47 victims escape dangerous relationships and provided them with the resources needed to rebuild their lives safely. My cabin, which Karen had intended to be Harry's final prison, became something entirely different. Harry and I decided to convert the basement into a comfortable meeting space where the foundation could hold support groups and counseling sessions for abuse survivors. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that the space Karen had chosen for its soundproofing and isolation now served as a place where victims could safely share their stories and find their voices again. 6 months after Karen's conviction, Pine Lake had transformed into a model community focused on transparency, mutual support, and protecting vulnerable residents. The new HOA board instituted policies requiring APAN meetings, published minutes, and community oversight of all major decisions. More importantly, residents began looking out for each other in ways that would have made Karen's manipulation tactics impossible to execute. As I sit on my deck now, watching another sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I often think about my grandfather's fishing lessons. He taught me that the biggest fish aren't always the strongest ones, they're the most patient ones, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Karen Mitchell thought she was the predator in our story, but patience and persistence ultimately revealed her to be just another fish caught in the net of justice. The cabin that she coveted as an instrument of death became instead a symbol of healing and hope, proving that sometimes the most beautiful transformation come from the darkest circumstances.